Good evening, everybody, and welcome to GeoIntel. My name is Cody Jordan. If you're looking for all of the latest happenings in geopolitics, this is the show for you. I have compiled all the latest news on all the latest happenings for everything from Ukraine to Greenland. We're going to be talking about Iran a little bit today. We're going to be talking about the Fed and the latest controversy between Trump and Powell. Pretty much everything that I have to discuss today is pretty lackluster, to be honest. I mean, in the last few days, there hasn't been a lot of updates. There's been a lot of talk around potentially escalating with Iran, and we'll kind of get into that. But mainly surrounding the topics like what's currently happening between Powell and Trump. That's pretty lackluster, and I'd like to one of these days do a show where I'm finally giving my opinion a little bit. Unfortunately, this is not going to be one of them. This is going to be mainly me just going through all of the stories that I've compiled from the news cycle over the last few days, and it's a lot of reading that I'm not looking forward to, but nevertheless, we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. So stay tuned if this is what you're into. We're going to start off with Venezuela. Again, there's not a ton of updates here, but I never covered the initial invasion, so I thought that it would be worthwhile to at least give an update on what has happened in the last week and a half, roughly, just to kind of give an overview as to what U.S. policy in that region should be looking like from here on out. So, I guess just to start it, this isn't really dealing with, this is dealing with our policy, actually. I just thought I'd mention this. So, on October 17th, 2025, there was an interview that resurfaced between a journalist in the White House and Trump, where the journalist told Trump, Maduro offered you everything and even recorded a message to you in English, to which Trump responded, he offered everything. You know why? Because he doesn't want to fuck around with the United States. And while that is funny, it does sort of point to the real issue here, which is that Maduro, before his ouster, was offering everything. And nevertheless, we still ended up not negotiating with him and moving forward with his ouster. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. First of all, you have Marco Rubio, who's been leading the situation since the start of Trump's term, and Rubio has a ton of beef with any communist/socialist government in that region, and Rubio, along with other components in the U.S. government, wanted Maduro's ouster regardless of what he was offering. And I guess I thought that I don't really know why I added that in there, to be honest with you, but just to kind of give you an idea as to how unwilling the United States is currently to really negotiate with the government and rather just assert its will on Venezuela. Now, I'm certainly not opposed to that. I think that we should be asserting our will in our hemisphere, but it's just kind of funny to go back and read that and kind of give you an idea as to our unwillingness to, I've already said this, it's going to be a long day, you guys. I've been compiling these notes since 4 a.m. today, and I'm already kind of tired, to be honest with you. So we're just going to go ahead and move on so I don't spin in circles there. So Venezuela, this is notes that I had set aside in regards to Trump's initial reasoning for wanting to invade. And then we're going to get into all the newest stuff, I promise. Venezuela unilaterally seized American oil and American assets, and they took all of our property. This is what Trump said in regards to why we started the invasion. Those assets were initially seized in 2007. And now, switching to the most current topics, Rubio said that the U.S. Navy will keep up a quarantine of some Venezuelan oil exports to coerce Maduro's allies to open up the oil industry. A White House official stated that that's what Trump meant when he said the U.S. will run Venezuela. And that kind of gives us an overview as to how we're going to be running policy in that region from here on out, which is this sort of gunboat diplomacy that we have played in that region in the past, although it has been a very long time, nearly a century since we've done that. And then we had a story coming out saying that multiple Russian, Chinese, and Iranian shadow tankers carrying stolen U.S. crude tried departing the ports of Venezuela in what looked like a coordinated effort to breach the naval blockade that we had imposed. In 2025, Venezuela supplied approximately 4% of China's total seaborne crude oil imports, based on consistent estimates from multiple analytic firms like Kepler and Vortexa. This equates to roughly 389,000 to 470,000 barrels per day out of China's overall crude imports, averaging around 11 to 12 million barrels per day. Trump said that he plans to cut U.S. oil prices to $50 per barrel by boosting Venezuelan output from 900,000 to 1.3 million barrels per day through sanctions relief and infrastructure fixes, adding supply equivalent to half of 2026's global demand growth. The risks to cutting oil prices to $50 per barrel include U.S. shale producers halting investments below 61 a barrel profitability, and OPEC plus cuts if prices dip below $55, affecting member countries of OPEC such as Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also, this sort of plays into exactly how this will be affecting former allies of the Venezuelan government under the Maduro regime. Iran had signed a 20-year pact, which it signed initially in 2022, to expand defense ties, including drones, fast attack boats, and intelligence sharing. Reports mention that Hezbollah presence and Quds Force activities in Venezuela were also happening. President Trump stated that the United States would move towards a second phase of strikes if Maduro's vice president and current president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, did not capitulate and agree to U.S. terms. Venezuela then announced that after this threat was made, they announced that they were going to be purchasing only American-made products with the money they received from our new oil deal. These purchases will include American agricultural products, American-made medicines, medical devices, and equipment to improve Venezuela's electric grid and energy facilities. Trump then, in a statement, said, quote, "Venezuela is releasing large numbers of political prisoners as a sign of seeking peace. This is a very important and smart gesture. Because of this cooperation, I have canceled the previously expected second wave of attacks, which looks like it will not be needed. However, all ships will stay in place for safety and security purposes. At least $100 billion will be invested by Big Oil." Of these prisoners that were released from Venezuela include the 2024 presidential candidate and Venezuelan opposition leader Enrique Marquez, who was one of the people freed. On January 9th, so roughly a week ago, the U.S. Department of State officials traveled to Caracas, which is in Venezuela, today for the first time since Maduro's ouster. It would mark an initial step towards reopening the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. Today, the White House, in regards to Delcy Rodriguez, said that the interim government in Venezuela has been extremely cooperative, and they thus far have met all demands and requests of Trump. Trump then announced, following this, that Cuba will not be receiving any oil from Venezuela. To which the Colombian president, Petro Gustavo, said, quote, and I'll show you this map in a minute, "This is Gran Colombia, the idea of Bolivar, and I propose by constituent vote of the population that we will rebuild it as a confederation of autonomous nations." So the Colombian president had announced this plan to basically form a republic, which I'll show you again here in a second, that resembled the United States insofar as the northern part of South America would be essentially imposing a state-like basis for all of the nation states that currently exist there in order to form a defense coalition in the region to combat U.S. aggression. And Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum then said that she rejected an offer from President Trump to use the U.S. military against the country's drug cartels. Panama's Supreme Court then said it is winding up deliberations that will decide whether a Hong Kong firm can run 2 ports at either end of the Panama Canal, a decision closely watched in Washington and Beijing. So this sort of just goes to show how even though Venezuela is currently cooperating with the United States, as we heard in that statement by the White House press secretary earlier today, that other countries in the region are trying to form defense coalitions and even are currently in talks with Hong Kong in terms of whether or not they can run ports at the end of the Panama Canal, which would pose a huge issue for the United States, who, since Trump got into office, has tried to retake U.S. control of the Panama Canal. Hong Kong, by the way, for those who don't know, was under the control of Britain up until, I believe, 2020, perhaps a tad bit earlier than that, and was eventually given back to China. It had been under the control of Britain and, to a degree, the United States since the Opium Wars, and that's a huge sect of history that I don't necessarily want to get into at the moment, but there were financial institutions that Britain and the United States had set up in Hong Kong, such as HSBC, which has been involved in all sorts of different scandals, that were helping facilitate the Opium Wars in our financial fight and drug fight against China for roughly 100 years, from about the mid-1800s until the 1950s, until China took back control of its nation, got over the century of humiliation, as they call it, and then eventually, as I just stated, took back Hong Kong. But back on the Venezuelan topic, Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado is scheduled to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House today on Thursday. Maria Machado is one of the main opposition leaders who is currently in the United States, one of the main opposition leaders in Venezuela. And this sort of is, in my estimation, sort of a campaign on behalf of the Trump government to further pressure the current Venezuelan regime to, again, stick to the United States mandates for Venezuela. And Trump meeting with Maria Machado is sort of him pointing a finger at Delcy Rodriguez, saying that if you don't continue to cooperate, we will go ahead and move forward with the secondary strike and put someone in that position who will. Okay, that's enough for Venezuela. So, Greenland, you know what? I'm sure if there is anybody currently watching this live, I kind of doubt it, but if there is, I apologize. I'm going to really quickly, I know I just started, I'm going to really quickly take a break because I have to use the restroom. I'll be very quick about it, and I'll come back and we'll get the rest of this finished up. So, I will be right Okay, and we're back. I promised I'd be fast about it. Just try to get my camera refocused here. Perfect. Okay, we're back. Now on to Greenland. On January 6th, Trump and his team started discussing options to acquire Greenland, including potential military force. The French Foreign Minister, Barrett, said in response to this that France is developing a plan with partners to respond if a U.S. threat against Greenland actually materializes. Trump, when questioned by a reporter at a meeting at the White House as to why he was considering military force against Greenland, said, quote, "Because when we own it, we defend it. You don't defend leases the same way, you have to own it." I have issue with this specifically regarding the rest of NATO, because if that statement were to stand, which I don't think that Trump actually meant that, I do think that that's strictly rhetoric that was meant to sort of put the fear of God into Greenland and the people who have an interest in it currently, whether it be France or the Danish. That statement is obviously nonsense, because Greenland being a part of NATO, we have to defend it because of the treaty that we have with NATO. If any other NATO nation, NATO ally, were to be attacked, invaded, it would be required of us, and it would be unquestionable that the United States would protect it at this point in time. We are still a part of NATO. We have not withdrawn from it, even though it has been perhaps discussed, although I think any discussion of it has been, absolutely nonsensical. Trump, then a report came out by the Daily Mail saying that Trump ordered his special force commanders to draw up special plans for the invasion of Greenland. And again, this, in my estimation, was nothing more than Trump's campaign to push Greenland into taking this threat seriously. Retired French General Nicolas Richaud said, quote, "If something happens in Greenland, they, the Americans, are no longer even systemic adversaries. They become enemies." And again, this plays into exactly why I don't think that any of these threats are actually serious. I think that it's part of a larger play, although I don't think that most of the time Trump is playing any sort of quote-unquote 4D chess. I do think that in this instance he is playing into a much larger plan here, which I'll discuss in just a moment. But before I do, I'm going to go ahead and play that video for you of the French commander stating that.
Le Groenland, c'est la ligne rouge. Donc, je considère que si ils envahissent le Groenland...
You know what? I'll just go ahead and narrate it as well for those watching.
Greenland
is the red line, so I consider that if they invade Greenland, if something happens in Greenland, they can no longer even be systematic adversaries. They become enemies, because when they attack a country territorially, what's the use of armies if you don't use them? Countries, if we let that happen, we'd better, the 50 or 55 billion we want to spend on defense in France is better spent on something else, perhaps social welfare, if we're not capable of defending our territory. Belonging to the United States of America and Russia, how about it belonged... Sorry, it's just moving too fast here. They're speaking so fast in French. How about if it belonged to the Danish? What if it simply belonged to the Greenlanders, frankly? You shouldn't talk nonsense. There's a population... Yeah, they're just going back and forth here. That's basically the end of that. But just to give you an idea, there are people within the French government, just like the retired general of the French military, making those exact claims. Okay. Back to Greenland. So yesterday, Sweden, France, Germany, and I believe one other country that I did not include in this, I wish I would have, but Sweden, France, and Germany, following all of this rhetoric, said that they will commit to sending troops to Greenland. Danish Defense Minister Truls Lund-Poulsen, announced that Denmark is starting a military exercise in Greenland, and that there will be increased military activity there with ships, planes, and soldiers. Norway's opposition worries that Trump's plans for Greenland could result in Norway losing Svalbard, which I should pull that up on a map here just to kind of give you an idea. Pull this up on Google Earth for you. Show you where Svalbard is on a map. Okay, so I'll just kind of zoom out here. So obviously, here is the Arctic Circle right here. Here's Greenland, and here, this little, I don't know exactly how far it expands to. I think perhaps out to here. Let me see. This is Svalbard. I don't know if it expands all the way out here. Let's see. I don't believe that it does. But Svalbard is sort of part of this exact same choke point that Greenland exists in. So in the Arctic region here, you only have a handful of countries that even have access to the Arctic. You have Canada, you have America, obviously, as far as Alaska goes over here, which I hope you guys can see my mouse, because if not, this is kind of pointless. But you also have all of Russia, which expands along this northern border here. You have Greenland, you have Norway, you have, well, I guess that would be Russia as well. So really, you only have these 5 countries that have access to the Arctic. Within the last few decades, because of shifts in temperature in the Arctic, you now, and also improved technology by the Russians in terms of icebreaker ships, they now have the ability to move through the Arctic, Russian submarines as well, and potentially start to pass through these choke points that currently exist here. We used to rely on countries like Iceland and the United Kingdom to monitor any activity through these regions. But the United States, aside from looking strictly at the control of the mineral resources of Greenland, would like to see more forces stationed in this region for that exact purpose of monitoring this exact gap here, because if Russian ships or subs move through this gap here, they have access to the Atlantic, which obviously gives them access to Canada, the United States, and every other portion of our sphere of influence, which becomes even more relevant as within the recent days, weeks, although it's been relevant for decades at this point, perhaps more so now with the rising tension in Venezuela. You have Vladimir Putin restating his, what's the term I'm looking for here, support for former Soviet-aligned regimes such as the one in Cuba. So we are now more than ever trying to focus on this gap here, and Greenland plays a crucial role in that. And also Svalbard does. Svalbard, which would be far easier for the United States to take over if we were looking to do so. Svalbard currently is a part of Finland, but just like Greenland, I do not believe that the taking over of Svalbard is actually a legitimate security goal for the United States. I think that it's more rhetoric to try and get NATO to put more military assets in Greenland. This, of course, is something that Trump has been trying to, not Greenland in specific, but NATO in general. He's been trying to get them to boost their military output. He's been trying to get them to boost their spending in NATO because they were not meeting the requirements that they had agreed upon in terms of defense spending. I think currently 5% of GDP is what is required of them and what they have agreed upon. I don't currently know whether or not Greenland has reached those demands, but pretty much the rest of the EU has. Now, again, Finland was, and I'll get back to the rest of this in just a second, but Finland was worried because they currently control Svalbard that perhaps it could be next on the United States' quote-unquote to-do list. However, although Svalbard is not a country, it is a part of Finland, and because Finland is a part of NATO, it theoretically, well, it is in practice, also protected by the same status that Greenland is in terms of existing treaties with NATO. Okay, that's enough of that. Okay, so German defense minister on sending soldiers to Greenland said, NATO will not allow Russia and China to use the Arctic for military purposes. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Rasmussen said, the goal of our military exercises is to ensure more permanent military presence in Greenland, relying on our army and our allies. The Kingdom of Denmark has already stepped up our own contribution by committing additional funds for military capabilities. In our view, the group should focus on addressing American security concerns while at the same time respecting the red lines of the Kingdom of Denmark. We expect this group to meet for the first time within a matter of weeks. So with all of that being said, it seems to me as though this entire play by Trump was to do nothing more than to get Greenland to boost its military capabilities, which up until this point it seems as though he's been completely successful in doing so. Alright, we're done with Greenland. On to the next one. Let me just make sure my camera didn't go out of focus. It always does every time I take a drink of something. There we go. Need to get a better camera. Alright, so now we're going to be focusing on the Fed and all of this drama surrounding Jerome Powell. The DOJ launched an investigation into Jerome Powell, to which the White House, after tons of pressure and questioning from the White House press pool, said that Trump did not ask the DOJ to investigate Powell, which I do not believe is true for a second. The U.S. President Donald Trump on the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said, quote, he's been a lousy Fed chairman. He's been too high on interest rates, and I call him too late. He heads up a construction situation. He's into billions and billions of dollars, and it looks like they won't open for a long time. He's either corrupt or incompetent. Now, in regards to the billions of dollars that was just mentioned there, he's specifically referring to the latest additions to the Federal Reserve building in Washington. But ultimately, this entire pressure campaign by the DOJ, even though Trump claims that he's not a part of it, is to try and pressure Jerome into lowering interest rates. So let's talk about that for a second. He said that he's been too high on interest rates. Well, just pull this up here, pull up some more of my notes. While this is last year, so 2025, the last quarter of last year of 2025, the United States had rising inflation. So from it would have been the second half, I suppose. From July all the way to September, we went from 2.7 to 3% inflation, or 2.7 to 3% CPI, which is the same exact thing. And I'm getting this from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. In that time, we had not cut rates. And this is when Trump was freaking out, wanting Powell to cut rates. We are supposed to, or rather the Fed, its stated goal is to keep inflation roughly around 2%. So anytime it is above 2%, the Federal Reserve rather, is supposed to raise rates in order to combat this. But in the exact same time that Trump was freaking out, from the time that he got in office until September, inflation had rose roughly 6% in that time. And finally, the Fed sees signs that the inflation rate might start to stall or go down, and they go ahead and decide to start cutting rates. So we had 3 rate cuts last year, one in September, which was 25 basis points, one in October, which was 25, and another in December, which again was 25. So a total of 75 basis points, or 0.75%. This got us down to the effective federal funds rate of 3.64 to 3.72, and the current target rate was 3.5 to 3.75. So in other words, we're exactly in the range that the Fed wants to be as far as that goes. Following this, the inflation rate started to drop. So we went from 3% in September. We did not have any recorded data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for October, but we went from 3% in September down to 2.7, where it currently sits at, which is the last recorded rate in December. So theoretically, you could make the argument that Trump is right to start pressuring Powell to once again lower or cut rates. However, we are still above the Fed's stated 2% goal, which they have shifted away from in the past year or two. But it has been a long-standing Federal Reserve policy to try and keep inflation at roughly 2%, which we are still above. So if the Fed decides to just not do any rate cuts at all, or raise rates again, they would technically be in the right to do so, even though it looks like inflation could continue to fall. Back to my notes here. So, following this pressure campaign, the central bank heads of, just counting this right now, 10 different banks said that we stand in full solidarity with Powell. I won't even bother mentioning which banks those were because, quite frankly, none of them matter except for one, the BIS. For those of you who don't know what the BIS is the Bank of International Settlements. And when it comes to banks, they are the biggest of the big. They are the most important bank in the world, the Bank of International Settlements. They act as the central bank for central banks. So in the same way that the Federal Reserve is the central bank for all subsequent banks in the United States, whether it be the Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, you name it, the BIS acts as a central bank for the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England. And they were part of this statement stating that, you know what, sorry guys, hold on. I hate to keep cutting this, but I will be right back. Okay, we just had some issues there. So the BIS came out and said that we stand in full solidarity with Powell. Following this, the BIS being the heaviest hitter of all of those banks in that statement, and arguably the heaviest hitter in all of the financial world, President Trump then came out with a statement on Wednesday stating that he has no plans to fire Jerome Powell despite a Justice Department criminal investigation into the Federal Reserve chair, but it was, quote, too early to say what he would ultimately do. Following all of this, the Fed came out and said that they expect to see rate cuts this year, although they did not specify when. For all we know, it could be in the second half of the year, it could be in the final quarter of the year. And to follow up on all of this, just to kind of end up this little segment here with the Fed, Bank of America said that this is the weakest labor market since 2011. The BBC said that 34% of the jobs advertised were positions listed with no intent to hire. A Gallup poll was stated showing 45% of Americans say their financial security is worsening, while only 20% say it's getting better. And the Wall Street Journal said that the number of employed Americans aged 65 and over rose by more than 33% since 2015. And our last two topics here I have for you are Ukraine and Iran. So there's been a ton of updates on Ukraine within the last few weeks. There's been a huge pressure campaign by Ukraine in terms of striking oil tankers that Russia controls in the Black Sea and the Baltic region, as well as different strategic strikes that they have been carrying out with drones that they have been flying into the western portion of Russia, striking targets in and around Moscow. A Ukrainian suicide drone struck the empty 274-meter-long Elbis oil tanker. It was on its way to pick up oil in a Russian port when it was hit 30 miles off Turkey's Black Sea coast. Reports suggest that 10 tankers have been targeted with kinetic strikes since late November, with another 6 seizures capturing shadow tankers leaving Venezuela. While this proposes challenges to come for Russian oil, the total of 16 tankers targeted, only half of which were Russian vessels, represent a very small fraction of over 1,200 estimated shadow tankers that they possess in their national fleet. 4 of the aforementioned oil tankers targeted in kinetic strikes were run by Greek shipping companies and were targeted in the Black Sea on Tuesday as they headed to load crude at the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal near Russia's coast. British authorities then said that they are preparing to begin seizing Shadow Fleet vessels following the U.S. example, and also to use the oil they carry to fund military assistance to Ukraine. 2 tankers could become potential targets as they are expected to pass through the English Channel on Wednesday. Which, by the way, this sort of plays into, and I'll just bring this back up again on my media window. This really plays into this gap here. So all of these tankers that are going from South America back to Russia, they're passing through this channel here. And they're passing through the channel that the UK controls. But furthermore, they're passing through these channels that Greenland and Norway controls. Last week, China, Russia, and Iran began a week of naval exercises in South African waters described as BRICS Plus operation to ensure safety of shipping and maritime economic activities. These 3 countries pairing up to do this, in my estimation, clearly signals that they're starting to get worried about, specifically speaking about China and Iran. Russia, obviously, but China and Iran also. They're starting to become extremely worried about the future of shipping coming from outside sources being imported into those countries or even exported from those countries. And that's why they're holding this joint operation in South African waters. And it's clearly been an effective campaign because China-Russia trade fell for the first time in 5 years. Bilateral trade, which surged by tens of percent after the start of the war in Ukraine and Russia's isolation from Western markets, fell by 6.5% over the year to 1.63 trillion yuan, which equates to roughly $234 billion US dollars. Both sides saw declines. Chinese exports to Russia dropped by 3.4% year on year, while Russian exports to China fell by 9.9%. And this doesn't just have to do with the current campaign that we have been imposing against these oil tankers. It also has to do with sanctions that have been put on any countries doing business with Russia in particular, but now it also has to do with the 25% tariff increase that Trump has recently put on any country doing business with Iran. Asked why U.S.-led negotiations had not yet resolved Europe's largest land conflict since World War II, Trump responded, Zelensky. And this sort of hints at, you know what, let me take a drink of this before I get into that. I've been talking for 45 minutes and my voice is just not used to doing this much talking. I'm a pretty isolated person, so anytime I'm speaking for 45 straight minutes, it just kills me. Let me make sure my camera didn't go out of focus. Of course it did. Every time I take a drink, it goes out of focus. Okay. Get that pulled back up. So again, I'll just reiterate this. Asked why U.S.-led negotiations had not yet resolved Europe's largest land conflict since World War II, Trump responded, Zelensky. This really points at something that I have argued has been the case in the last roughly 12 to 24 months, although Trump, until recently, has sort of gone away from this position, stating that Putin was to blame for not wanting to end the conflict. Now he's sort of back on his initial position, which he had at the start of his term, stating that it's really Zelensky that doesn't want this conflict to end. So going back to the trade deficit that Russia has been seeing between themselves and China, and the money lost, the $234 billion lost in trade, it's really been affecting Russia heavily, and they're starting to get, I wouldn't say desperate, but they're starting to act as if though they are desperate. Recently, I've been seeing videos come out of Russian soldiers using cavalry, which is something that I have not personally seen on any battlefield since World War I. There may have been some of it in World War II, but if there was, it was so insignificant that you'd never even hear about it. But within the last few weeks, I have seen videos of Ukrainians taking horses that belonged to Russian cavalry officers after they were assassinated by Ukrainian forces. But this really just goes to show the extreme lack of supplies that Russia is running into as this war continues to go on. We also have seen videos recently of Africans being tricked into migrating to Russia, given the hopes of high-paying jobs, and they're immediately, and it's not just Africans, by the way, there are other countries, other continents that are experiencing this exact same thing. They are just immediately going to Russia in hopes of a better life and immediately being thrown on the front lines. I saw a pretty disturbing video. It could have been propaganda, but I have my reasons to doubt it, of I believe a Congolese person, a Congolese unit, but one person in particular out of this unit having a mine strapped on his chest and being forced by Russian soldiers to advance towards enemy positions and being used as cannon fodder. And while you could make the argument that it's horrible, but while you can make the argument that it is smart strategically on the Russian side to not risk their own men, their own soldiers, it just as likely is signaling their weakness in their positions. Up until the time that Trump got into office, you could absolutely make the case that Russia was winning the war. They'd arguably been winning the war since the start of it. But with these recent developments, it seems as though Putin is now more ready than ever to try and resolve this. And Zelensky is the one that's ultimately holding up the peace talks. Russia has acquired all of the ground that they hoped to acquire at the start of the war. All of the main territories that they wanted to conquer, they have. And so a part of this peace negotiations, if they were to happen, would ultimately include Russia holding on to this territory that they've conquered. Zelensky wants to hold on to all of Ukraine, but Ukraine is, while they may have been making progress within the last few months, they ultimately have been getting absolutely decimated up until this point. And it would be in everyone's best interest, including the countries like the United States that have been funding it, to go ahead and resolve it as quickly as possible, in my estimation. Now on to Iran. I don't have a ton here, unfortunately. I have a feeling that I might start to spiral into a rant like I just did there. So hopefully this doesn't go on for too much longer. How long has this stream been going on? 46 minutes. It's not terrible. We'll get this out of the way and wrap this up because I am over it. Hopefully my next stream is not just me reading a ton of news stories. I really kind of want to get into more opinionated pieces because while they're perhaps not as informative, they are way more fun to do. Just sitting and reading this nonstop, I just get tunnel vision and it drives me crazy. But nevertheless, and it just kills my voice. Like I said, I'm not used to talking for 45 straight minutes or an hour straight. Iran state television aired footage of the bodies of killed protesters and the bullets that killed them. Iranian propagandists claim that the victims were allegedly killed by trained terrorists, asserting that these individuals were among the protesters themselves. So you can see in that Iran is trying to shift the blame of a lot of the people that were killed, stating that it was terrorist cells hidden within the protesters that were doing a lot of the killing. I've seen tons of videos within the last 2 weeks that points to that not being the case. There were besieged forces and IRGC forces that were just indiscriminately firing into these crowds of people. They were not individually targeting people that were throwing Molotov cocktails or shooting back either. They were just indiscriminately firing. So they're trying to shift the blame here. That's not to say that there were not trained quote-unquote terrorist cells within these groups. There absolutely were Kurdish forces who had been armed by the Israelis who were sparking and furthering a lot of the violence within these protests. So there's blame on both sides. There's no such thing as a right or wrong necessarily in terms of a situation like this. You have rioters who completely destroyed entire cities. They were burning mosques. They were destroying bank branches. They were carrying out political assassinations. And then you have the Iranian government who had to quell the riots in order to gain control of their country back. But simultaneously, you had people within the Iranian forces who were arguably committing terrorist acts themselves. A UN Security Council meeting on Iran may take place today at the request of the United States. Recently, Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the former Shah of Iran, has been giving tons and tons of talks, really sort of coordinated propaganda to try and spark up these protests and keep them going. He has an interest in being himself reinstalled in some form of a position of power in Iran, which is why he has been giving these speeches and trying to further the protests. He would like to see himself and his family be reinstated into power in Iran, which is why he's been giving these speeches. But the U.S. government to a degree, as well as the Israelis, and a lot of the rioters themselves were screaming, "Long live the Shah." The U.S. government and the Israelis weren't, but the rioters were screaming, "Long live the Shah," and this is specifically referencing Reza Pahlavi. However, it looks like at the moment that there has not been enough support seen amongst the people within Iran for the Israeli or American government to take him seriously, because Trump said recently that, quote, "Reza Pahlavi seems very nice," but he questioned whether he could secure enough support inside Iran to lead the country if the Islamic Republic was to collapse. The Israeli army was placed on maximum alert and was fully ready for a U.S. strike last night. The Israeli Air Force was activated during the night for a possible escalation, but it seemed the U.S. called off the attack in the last minute. Israeli Channel 14 said that Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia played a critical role in calling off the U.S. strike on Iran last night. All three countries rejected an escalation and informed the White House that they would not grant U.S. forces their airspaces to strike Iranian territory from. Saudi Arabia was the first of these countries to state this, and being the largest of the country of those and wealthiest of those countries. The rest were soon to follow suit. And while Saudi Arabia on its own might not hold a ton of weight against the United States government, as soon as it starts to form a coalition amongst other countries such as Qatar and Turkey, it automatically formed a very big problem for the United States, which, as I'll discuss in a minute, they did not think that they could overcome. U.S. intelligence had assessed that if the United States were to conduct a military strike against Tehran, that Iran would retaliate by again attacking military bases in the region. According to U.S. officials briefed on the intelligence, American spy agencies believe that in addition to the base in Qatar, Iran could possibly strike at U.S. forces stationed in bases in Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And this is exactly why Saudi Arabia and Qatar did not want these strikes to be carried out, because they knew that Iran would start immediately lobbing missiles into their own territory at the U.S. bases that are currently stationed there, and that would be a huge mess that they would have to deal with. An Iranian source reported that a regional partner said Washington has scrapped plans to strike Iran after receiving updated intelligence of the potential fallout of an attack. Iran's foreign minister said that he spoke by phone with Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan. Iran and Saudi Arabia determined that the two countries need to strengthen Iran-Saudi relations, quote, in all areas of mutual interest, end quote, warning that regime change could destabilize the region and create a vacuum that Israel could move to fill in. And Israeli Channel 12 went ahead and reinstated that point to a degree, because they said in a recent news piece that, quote, Israel estimates that if a revolution breaks out in Iran, the fall of Hezbollah will occur within weeks. When the money for salaries, reconstruction, and weapons run out, if Iran attacks Israel when the U.S. Let me just start from the beginning. I messed that up. Israel estimates that if a revolution breaks out in Iran, the fall of Hezbollah will occur within weeks, when the money for salaries, reconstruction, and weapons run out. If Iran attacks Israel when the United... I typed this terribly because I keep stuttering on this, but Israel said that if they were to receive missile strikes from Iran following a U.S. strike, that they would move in to topple the regime, the Iranian regime. Lindsey Graham, following all of the pushback by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, Turkey, he came out in a ton of different press releases stating that he was just disgusted by it and that we should move forward anyways. of course, Lindsey Graham's faggot ass never once in his life saw a war or a potential war that he could not support and make money off of. I just had to throw that in there, pardon me. Other attack options, such as cyber attack or a strike against Iran's domestic security apparatus, which is using lethal force against protesters, remains more likely, the officials have said. Any attack is at least several days away and could prompt a vigorous retaliation from Iran. Iran's Civil Aviation Authority said the country's airspace is reopening to all arriving, departing, and transit flights. Now, to go back and reiterate the other attack options, such as cyber attack or strikes against Iran's domestic security apparatus, these do still seem likely to me, although Iran is reopening its airspace, because the U.S. would have been very unwise to go ahead and strike without having backups in the region to reinforce those strikes. We currently have an aircraft carrier strike group that consists of an aircraft carrier, 3 other support ships, and I believe 1 or 2 nuclear-armed subs. The USS Abraham Lincoln, I believe, is arriving in the Middle East within the next 5 days. When that aircraft carrier group arrives, the possibility of increased tensions again is far, far more likely. So while we may not see strikes this week, I would not be surprised if we start to see strikes perhaps by, let's just say, next Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, if we are to go ahead and directly strike Iran's domestic security, like the besieged militias, missile exchanges between the United States and Iran and Israel are far, far more likely. And while that is the worst case scenario, I do not think that it is unlikely that that is going to happen, because Israel has been so adamant in its want to overthrow the Iranian regime, and its adamance that Hezbollah will be ultimately destroyed within no time if the Iranian regime is to fall. We just, within the last week, saw a renewed bombing campaign that Trump approved in Lebanon. We even saw Lebanon's government capitulate with the Israelis and said that from basically here on out, they were going to allow these bombing campaigns to continue without pushback. After airspace reopened and the bomb shelters that the Israelis had opened temporarily reclosed, we saw Israel go back into Lebanon and start bombing Hezbollah forces once again. So the Israeli campaign against Hezbollah has not ended, not one bit. It will not end until the Iranian regime is toppled. And it seems far more likely to me that we are simply waiting for that aircraft carrier strike group to arrive in the Middle East as reinforcements, not only for our military bases, but also for the airspaces of the countries in which they reside, whether it be Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Qatar. And then last but not least, and then I'll finally wrap this up here, the New York Times, citing a U.S. official, said, quote, "The attack is not expected to happen for several days, and Iran may respond with force. Trump will receive a briefing on the options today. Some in the Trump administration believe that Iran is trying to delay the attack rather than pursuing diplomacy. And that is it, guys. Thank God. My voice is shot. If you guys liked any of this content, please like, comment, best of all, subscribe. Liking and, well, if you're going to like the video, that's great, but commenting would be even better. That really helps out the engagement. I'm going to continue to bring you this content, even as much as it pains me. I love doing, the research and all of that stuff. It's just recording, editing these videos and all that. It's a huge pain in the ass, but nevertheless, I'm going to continue to do it, so please support me if you can. If you like the content, stick around. There will be plenty more to come. See, I've been talking for so long, I can't even get my words straight anymore. But I'll see you guys hopefully soon. Thanks for sticking around if you did. We'll see you later. Thanks. Peace.